The most powerful god in Asgard awakens in absolute panic. Mjölnir, the hammer capable of destroying mountains and crushing entire armies, has vanished during the night. Without his legendary weapon, Thor is not just vulnerable. All of Asgard stands at the mercy of the giants. What happens next is one of the most humiliating and surprising stories in Norse mythology. To recover his hammer, the god of thunder will have to do something he never imagined. He will have to dress as a bride and marry the giant who stole Mjölnir. The golden halls of Asgard gleamed under the eternal light that bathed the realm of the gods. In his magnificent chamber, Thor, son of Odin, the god of thunder and protector of both gods and men, stirred from his sleep. His massive frame, built like the mountains themselves, shifted under silk covers embroidered with scenes of his greatest victories. His red beard, thick and wild, framed a face that had witnessed countless battles. Thor's hand instinctively reached for the leather strap beside his bed, searching for the familiar weight of Mjölnir. His fingers grasped only empty air. His eyes shot open. The hammer was gone. For a moment, Thor lay frozen, his mind refusing to accept what his senses told him. Then reality crashed down like a thunderclap. He bolted upright, his voice erupting in a roar that shook the very foundations of Asgard. The sound wave rippled outward, rattling the golden shields that lined the walls, toppling goblets from tables in distant halls, and sending servants scrambling in fear. Birds scattered from the palace gardens. In the throne room, Odin himself looked up sharply, recognizing the particular quality of his son's rage. This was not the battle cry of a warrior charging into combat. This was the sound of genuine fear. Thor tore through his chambers like a whirlwind, overturning furniture, ripping tapestries from walls, searching every corner with increasing desperation. Mjölnir was not simply a weapon. It was the very symbol of his power, forged by the dwarf brothers Sindri and Brakr in the heart of a dying star. With Mjölnir, Thor had defended Asgard against countless invasions. He had crushed the skulls of frost giants, battled the Midgard serpent, and brought order to the chaos that constantly threatened the Nine Realms. Without it, he was still formidable, still a god, but he was vulnerable. More importantly, Asgard was vulnerable. The giants, those ancient enemies who dwelt in the frozen wastelands of Jotunheim, had always been held at bay by one thing above all others: the knowledge that Thor wielded Mjölnir. The hammer was not just a weapon, but a deterrent, a promise of swift and terrible retribution for any who dared threaten the realm of the gods. And now it was gone. Thor's mind raced through possibilities. Who could have taken it? Who would dare? His thoughts immediately turned to Loki, the shape-shifting trickster god, his sometime companion and frequent source of trouble. Loki had played countless pranks over the centuries, each more elaborate than the last. But stealing Mjölnir crossed a line from mischief into genuine treachery. Thor stormed from his chambers, his bare feet pounding against the marble floors as he made his way through the labyrinthine corridors of Asgard's greatest palace. Servants pressed themselves against walls as he passed, recognizing the dangerous energy radiating from the thunder god. He found Loki in the great hall, reclining on a bench with characteristic nonchalance, a goblet of wine in his slender fingers. Loki's sharp features, handsome in an almost feline way, registered mild surprise as Thor grabbed him by the front of his tunic and lifted him effortlessly into the air. The wine spilled across the floor. "Loki, where is my hammer?" Thor's voice was deadly quiet now, which was somehow more terrifying than his earlier roar. The trickster god's green eyes widened, and for once, his usual smirk was absent. "Thor, I swear by the roots of Yggdrasil, I had nothing to do with this. Check my chambers, search my belongings, question my servants. I am many things, brother, but I am not fool enough to steal Mjölnir." Thor studied Loki's face, searching for any hint of deception. Despite all their conflicts, he had learned to read the trickster's tales over countless years. And what he saw now was genuine surprise and, more tellingly, genuine concern. Loki understood better than most what the loss of Mjölnir meant. If the giants learned that Thor was without his hammer, they would march on Asgard before the next sunrise. Thor released Loki, who straightened his rumpled clothing with an indignant sniff. If you did not take it, then who did? The question hung in the air between them. Loki's mind, always quick, began working through the possibilities. Giants, he said finally. It has to be the giants. They are the only ones with both the audacity and the motivation. But which giant? And how did they penetrate Asgard's defenses to steal from your very bedside? These are questions that require investigation. Thor, come with me. We need Freya's help. The two gods made their way to Freya's hall, a place of beauty that stood in stark contrast to the martial grandeur of Thor's dwelling. Here, everything spoke of fertility, love, and the softer aspects of divine power. Golden light filtered through windows of colored glass. The air was heavy with the scent of flowers that bloomed in all seasons. Freya herself reclined on a couch draped in furs, her legendary beauty undiminished by the early hour. Her golden hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and around her neck gleamed the Brisingamen, the necklace of the Brisings, the most precious jewel in all the 9 realms. She looked up as Thor and Loki entered, and her expression immediately grew serious. She knew Thor well enough to recognize when something was truly wrong. Freya, Thor began, his voice still rough with suppressed rage, I need your feather cloak. My hammer has been stolen, and we suspect the giants are behind this theft. The goddess did not hesitate. Of course, she said, rising gracefully. If Mjölnir is truly lost, then we are all in danger. I would lend you this cloak even if it were made of pure gold and silver. Take it, and may it serve you well in your search. She crossed to an ornate chest and withdrew a cloak made of falcon feathers, each one shimmering with an iridescence that seemed to capture and reflect light in impossible ways. This was no ordinary garment, but a magical artifact that allowed its wearer to take the form of a bird and fly with the speed of thought itself. Loki reached for the cloak before Thor could. I will go, he said. You are many things, Thor, but subtle is not among them. If we are to gather information from the giants without alerting them to your vulnerability, it requires a lighter touch. Thor's jaw clenched, but he knew Loki spoke truth. The trickster god donned the feather cloak, and immediately his form shimmered and shifted. Where a god had stood, now perched a falcon with eyes of uncanny intelligence. With a powerful thrust of its wings, the bird launched itself into the air, soaring up through the open roof of Freya's hall and into the vast sky above Asgard. The journey to Jotunheim was not long for one traveling by magic and wing. Loki flew over the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost, past Midgard where humans toiled in their short lives, and into the frozen wastes where the giants made their home. Jotunheim was a realm of eternal winter, where mountains of ice rose like jagged teeth against gray skies, and the wind howled with voices that spoke of ancient sorrows and endless hunger. The landscape was beautiful in its terrible way, but it was a hostile beauty that offered no comfort. Loki descended toward the largest of the ice palaces, where Thrym, king of the frost giants, held court. The trickster god landed on a ridge overlooking the palace and watched. There, seated on a burial mound in a courtyard of packed snow, was Thrym himself. The giant king was enormous even by the standards of his people, easily 30 feet tall, with skin the pale blue of deep ice and eyes like chips of glacier. He was engaged in the peaceful pursuits of a wealthy lord, braiding golden collars for his massive hunting dogs and combing the manes of horses the size of elephants. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that seemed almost absurd given the theft that had just occurred. Loki transformed back into his natural form and approached openly. Subtlety sometimes meant hiding in plain sight, and giants respected boldness. Thrym looked up as the god approached, and a slow smile spread across his face. Loki, son of Laufey, he rumbled in a voice like grinding glaciers. What brings one of the Aesir to my humble kingdom? How fare the gods? How fare the elves? Loki returned the smile, though his eyes remained cold and calculating. It fares ill with the Aesir, and ill with the elves, he replied. But you know this already. Do you not, Thrym? You know why I am here. Tell me, have you hidden the Thunderer's hammer? The giant's smile widened. showing teeth like icebergs. He made no attempt to deny it. "Indeed, I have," he said with evident satisfaction. "I have buried Thor's precious Mjölnir 8 leagues deep in the frozen earth, where no one can find it save myself. The shafts I dug go down through layers of ice that have not seen sunlight since before the first age of men. No spell can reveal it, no dwarf can dig fast enough to reach it before I am alerted, and no strength save my own can lift the weight of ice that entombs it." Loki kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he was recalculating. This was worse than he had feared. Thrym had not acted on impulse, but had planned this theft carefully. And what would it take, Loki asked carefully, for Mjölnir to be returned to its rightful owner? The giant king stood, his massive frame blocking out the weak sun. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of absolute conviction. "There's only one thing I desire, only one treasure that Asgard possesses, which I do not. Bring me Freya, goddess of beauty, daughter of Njord from Noten, to be my bride. Let her stand before me in wedding clothes. Let her speak the vows that will bind her to me for eternity, and I will return the hammer." What do you think about this incredible tale so far? Drop the word hammer in the comments if you're still watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel because the story is about to get even more unbelievable. Loki felt a cold knot form in his stomach. This was no simple ransom demand. Thrym genuinely believed he could claim Freya as his wife, and the implications were staggering. Marriages between Aesir and giants were not unheard of, but they were matters of alliance, negotiation, and mutual consent. What Thrym proposed was essentially kidnapping dressed up in the language of matrimony. But Loki kept his face neutral and nodded as if considering the proposition seriously. "That is indeed a weighty price for a hammer," he said mildly. "But I will carry your message to Asgard and see what can be arranged." The giant king laughed, a sound like an avalanche. "I know what you are thinking, trickster. You think I am mad or foolish or both. But consider your position. Without Mjölnir, Thor is merely strong. With it, he is unstoppable. Every day that passes without the hammer in his hands is a day when my people grow bolder, when the old treaties seem less binding, when the natural order reasserts itself. You gods have ruled too long from your golden halls. Perhaps it is time for a new age, an age of ice and giants." Loki inclined his head in a gesture that could have meant anything and transformed back into falcon form. He took to the air, his mind racing as he flew back toward Asgard. Thrym had revealed more than he intended. This was not just about desire for Freya, though the giant king clearly did covet her. This was about power, about testing the resolve of the gods, about seeing whether Asgard would truly pay any price to recover Thor's hammer. The flight back seemed to take half the time, though Loki's racing thoughts made it feel simultaneously like seconds and hours. He landed in the courtyard of the great hall where Thor waited, pacing like a caged beast. The thunder god stopped mid-stride as Loki transformed back into himself. "Well," Thor demanded, "what did you learn?" Loki chose his words carefully. "I found the thief. Thrym, king of the frost giants, admits freely to taking Mjölnir. He has hidden it 8 leagues deep in the frozen earth of Jotunheim, buried under so much ancient ice that retrieval by force or stealth is impossible. The hammer cannot be recovered unless Thrym chooses to return it." Thor's face darkened like storm clouds gathering. "And his price?" "His price," Loki said quietly, "is Freya. He demands she be brought to him as a bride. Only then will he return Mjölnir." For a moment, Thor simply stared, as if unable to process what he had heard. Then his face transformed with sudden hope. "Then that is what we must do," he declared. "Come, Loki. We must go to Freya at once and explain the situation. Surely she will understand what is at stake. She must agree to this marriage." Loki caught Thor's arm as the thunder god turned to leave. "Thor, wait. Think about what you are asking. This is not some temporary arrangement. Thrym wants actual marriage vows, binding for eternity. You cannot seriously expect Freya to sacrifice herself to a life of captivity among the giants." Thor pulled his arm free, his face flushed with desperation and anger. I expect her to do her duty to Asgard, just as I have done countless times. Without Mjölnir, we are all at risk. This is bigger than one goddess's preferences. The two gods found Freya in her private garden, tending to flowers that should not have been able to bloom in Asgard's climate, but flourished under her care. She looked up as they approached, and her expression grew wary. She had known these two long enough to recognize trouble when it walked toward her in tandem. Freya, Thor began without preamble. We have found who stole Mjölnir. It was Thrym, king of the frost giants. He demands a price for its return. He demands you. He wants you to travel to Jotunheim and marry him. Only then will he give back my hammer. The goddess's face went very still. For a long moment she said nothing, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then she began to laugh, but it was not a sound of amusement. It was the laugh of someone who has just heard something so absurd, so insulting. That laughter was the only possible response. "You cannot be serious," she said finally. "You come to me, to my own gardens, and tell me I must abandon everything, abandon my home, my freedom, my very identity, to become the captive bride of a frost giant, so that you can have your hammer back?" Thor stepped forward, his voice taking on a pleading quality. "Freya, please. You must understand. Without Mjölnir, all of Asgard is at risk. The giants will invade. Everything we have built will fall. I would not ask this if there were any other way." Freya's eyes flashed with sudden, terrible anger. "No," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "No, Thor. I will not do this. You speak of duty to Asgard? My duty has been to bring beauty, fertility, and life to these realms. I have never asked you to sacrifice your essential nature for my convenience. I will not sacrifice mine for yours." Then her rage truly ignited. The ground beneath her feet trembled. The air around her seemed to shimmer with heat, despite the coolness of the garden. Her voice rose to a shout that carried across all of Asgard. "If I agreed to this madness, if I went willingly to Jotunheim as a bride to Thrym, every being in the 9 realms would call me man-crazed. They would say Freya had lost her mind, that she had become so desperate for a husband that she would accept even a frost giant. My reputation would be destroyed, my dignity shattered." Her fury manifested physically. The Brisingamen, that legendary necklace she always wore, suddenly snapped from the force of her rage. The precious jewel flew from her neck and clattered across the stone pathway, its chain broken. Thor and Loki both stepped back involuntarily from the force of her anger. The halls of Asgard itself seemed to tremble in sympathy with the goddess's wrath. Windows rattled in their frames. In the great hall, Odin looked up sharply from his throne, recognizing that something significant was occurring. Freya's voice dropped again, but it had lost none of its intensity. "Find another way," she said coldly. "I am not a bargaining chip to be traded for a stolen weapon. If you want your hammer back, Thor, you will have to recover it through other means. I will help you in any way I can, lend you any resource I possess, but I will not become a sacrifice to your desperation." She turned and walked back into her hall, her posture rigid with fury, leaving Thor and Loki standing in the garden, surrounded by trembling flowers and the broken pieces of the Brisingamen scattered across the ground. Thor looked after her, his face a mixture of frustration, anger, and something that might have been shame. Within the hour, the great horn of Asgard had sounded, calling all the gods and goddesses to assembly in the enormous hall where the most important decisions affecting the 9 realms were made. This was the thing, the sacred gathering where even Odin listened to the counsel of his fellow deities before making judgments. The hall filled quickly with divine beings, each taking their accustomed place. Odin sat at the head, his single eye surveying all, his ravens Hugin and Munin perched on the arms of his throne. Frigg, his wife and queen, sat beside him, her face troubled. Thor stood before them all, his massive arms crossed, his expression stormy. Freya was present too, her face still flushed with anger, the mark where Brisingamen had rested still visible on her neck. Loki lounged against a pillar, watching the proceedings with his characteristic mixture of interest and amusement. Odin spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of ages. "We are faced with a crisis. Mjölnir, the greatest weapon of Asgard, has been stolen by Thrym and hidden where we cannot retrieve it by force. The giant king demands Freya as his bride in exchange for the hammer's return. Freya has refused, as is her right. We must now determine what course of action to take." Various gods spoke up, each offering their perspective. Some argued for a military assault on Jotunheim, though others pointed out that without Thor's hammer, the casualties would be catastrophic. Some suggested attempting to steal the hammer back, though Loki explained the impossibility of finding something buried 8 leagues deep in constantly shifting ice. Some even suggested simply accepting the loss and forging a new weapon, though the dwarves who had made Mjölnir were clear that such a creation could never be duplicated. The debate went in circles, growing more heated as each proposed solution was torn apart by practical objections. Thor's frustration mounted visibly. He started to speak several times, always stopping himself, his face growing redder with each passing minute. It was Heimdall who finally broke the deadlock. The watchman of the gods, he who stood guard at the Bifrost Bridge, and whose eyes could see to the ends of the 9 realms, rose from his seat. His golden teeth gleamed as he spoke, and there was something in his expression that suggested he had seen this moment coming long before it arrived. "I have a solution," Heimdall said calmly, and the assembly fell silent. "It is not a comfortable solution. It is not an elegant solution, but it will work." The gods leaned forward, waiting. Heimdall continued, "We cannot give Thrym what he truly wants, which is Freya. But we can give him what he thinks he wants, which is a bride dressed as Freya. Let Thor disguise himself as the goddess. Dress him in bridal clothes, cover his face with a veil, adorn him with the Brisingamen. Let Loki accompany him as a handmaiden. They will travel to Jotunheim, attend the wedding feast, and when Thrym brings forth Mjölnir to bless the bride, Thor can reclaim it and reveal his true identity." The silence that followed this suggestion was absolute. Every god in the hall seemed frozen, unsure whether Heimdall was joking. Then they looked at his face and realized he was deadly serious. Thor's reaction was immediate and explosive. His face went from red to almost purple. He stood up so fast that his chair toppled backward with a crash. "Dress me as a woman?" he roared. "Cover me in bridal clothes like some blushing maiden? You suggest that I, Thor, son of Odin, protector of Asgard and Midgard, should humiliate myself by pretending to be a bride? I would be mocked for eternity. The gods would laugh at me behind my back for the rest of time. I would rather face 1,000 giants in single combat than submit to such dishonor." The hall erupted in competing voices. Some gods laughed nervously, unable to help themselves at the mental image. Others protested that Heimdall's suggestion was too extreme. But a few, the older and wiser ones, nodded slowly, seeing the logic beneath the absurdity. It was Loki who spoke next, pushing himself away from the pillar and walking to stand beside Thor. His voice was serious, lacking its usual mocking tone. "Thor, listen to me. I know this seems impossible. I know every fiber of your being rebels against this idea. You are a warrior, and warriors do not wear bridal veils. But think beyond your pride for a moment. Think about what happens if we do nothing. Without Mjölnir, Thrym and his giants will grow bold. They will test our borders, raid our settlements, eventually march on Asgard itself. You are still mighty, still a god, but without your hammer, you cannot hold back an entire army of giants. Asgard will fall. The realms will fall into chaos. Is that really a better outcome than a few hours of embarrassment?" Thor glared at Loki, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might crack. The trickster god held his gaze steadily. "Think of it as a different kind of battle," Loki continued. "Not one fought with strength and thunder, but with cunning and deception. You would be going behind enemy lines in disguise. Soldiers do this all the time. We are at the halfway point of this incredible tale. The best part is yet to come. If you're enjoying this journey through Norse mythology, hit that subscribe button now. You won't want to miss what happens when Thor comes face to face with Thrym at the wedding feast. The fact that your disguise happens to be a wedding dress instead of enemy armor does not change the fundamental nature of the mission. You are infiltrating Jotunheim to recover stolen property. Thor's breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. Around the hall, other gods began to speak up in support of the plan. Frigg pointed out that many great heroes had used disguise to achieve their goals, that there was no shame in using one's wits instead of one's strength. Tyr reminded Thor that he had sworn an oath to defend Asgard by any means necessary. Even Freya spoke, her voice softer now, saying that she would personally help prepare the disguise if Thor agreed, that she would ensure he looked convincing enough to fool the giants. Finally, it was Odin who settled the matter. The All-Father stood from his throne, and immediate silence fell. His single eye fixed on his son, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of the King of Gods. Thor, you are my son, and I am proud of your strength and courage. But true courage is not simply the absence of fear. It is doing what must be done even when you are afraid, even when it costs you something precious. If you refuse this plan because of pride, then Asgard falls because of pride. Is your dignity truly worth the lives of everyone in this realm? Thor stood very still, the words of his father landing like hammer blows. Slowly, the rigid tension in his shoulders began to ease. His hands unclenched. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost defeated. "Very well," he said. "I will do this. I will dress as a bride and travel to Jotunheim. But know this, when I recover Mjölnir, when I have it in my hands again, there will be a reckoning. Thrym and every giant who participates in this mockery of a wedding will pay with their lives." The gods began to move immediately, understanding that the longer they waited, the more chance Thor might change his mind. Freya took charge of the preparations, leading Thor to her private chambers while calling for her handmaidens. What followed was perhaps one of the most surreal scenes in the long history of Asgard. Thor stood in the center of Freya's dressing room, a massive figure completely out of place among the delicate furniture and fine fabrics. The goddess and her attendants circled him like artists approaching a particularly challenging sculpture. The first challenge was finding a dress that would fit. Thor was not simply tall, but broad, with shoulders built for wielding weapons and a chest like a barrel. Eventually, they settled on creating a new gown, working with magical speed to craft something that would accommodate his frame while still looking appropriately bridal. The result was a masterpiece of white and silver fabric, embroidered with intricate patterns of flowers and birds. It fell in flowing layers to his feet, with long sleeves that covered his muscular arms. The dress was designed to be impressive at a distance, to speak of wealth and status, which would be expected of the goddess Freya. Around his waist, they fastened a girdle from which hung housewife's keys, the traditional symbol of a woman who would be managing a household. On his chest, they pinned brooches and jewelry that caught the light. The broken Brisingamen had been magically repaired, and they placed it around Thor's neck, where it gleamed against the white fabric. The necklace was too precious, too distinctive, to leave behind, and no frost giant would believe this was Freya without it. But the greatest challenge was Thor's face. His beard, thick and red and proud, was impossible to hide completely. Instead, they relied on a bride's veil, a creation of fine white silk that hung from an ornate headpiece. The veil was deliberately thick, obscuring his features, justified by the modesty expected of a bride. Beneath it, Thor's expression was thunderous, but at least it was hidden. They added a cap to help secure the veil and hide his hair, which, while long, was not styled in the manner of the goddesses. When they finally stepped back to examine their work, the result was surprisingly convincing. From a distance, especially to eyes expecting to see Freya, the disguise might actually work. Thor was tall for a woman, but not impossibly so, and the flowing dress hid the true nature of his powerful build. The veil concealed his face, and the jewelry and accessories created exactly the right impression of divine femininity. "Look," Freya said gently, producing a mirror of polished silver. Thor took it reluctantly and stared at his reflection. The figure looking back at him was a stranger, a bride dressed in finery, ready for a wedding. The disconnect between what he saw and what he knew himself to be was so profound that, for a moment, he could not speak. "I look ridiculous," he finally said, his voice muffled by the veil. "You look like a very tall, very well-dressed bride," Freya corrected. "Which is precisely what you need to look like. Remember, Thor, the giants have never actually seen me up close. Thrym's mental image of me is based on reputation and distant glimpses. He is expecting beauty and divinity, and this dress provides both. Trust in the disguise. Trust in the fact that people see what they expect to see." Loki entered the chamber at that moment, and his reaction was immediate. He burst out laughing, a genuine full-bodied laugh that he could not suppress despite the glares from everyone in the room. When he finally controlled himself, wiping tears from his eyes, he grinned at Thor. "Oh, this is magnificent," he said. "This is truly the greatest thing I have seen in centuries. Thor, you make a surprisingly convincing woman. Thrym will be absolutely delighted with his bride." Thor's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. The threat in his silence was more eloquent than any words. Loki, still grinning, submitted to his own transformation. His disguise was simpler, as befitted a handmaiden rather than a bride. The goddesses dressed him in a more modest gown, still fine but not ostentatious, and gave him a simple veil. Unlike Thor, Loki had no trouble adapting to the role. He moved in the dress as easily as he moved in his usual clothes, and when he spoke he pitched his voice higher, adopting a feminine manner that was utterly convincing. Loki had been many things over his long life, had worn many forms, and played many roles. One more disguise was nothing to him, and if this one happened to be amusing, so much the better. Before they left, Odin came to speak with his son privately. The All-Father looked at Thor in his bridal disguise, and something complicated passed across his ancient face. Sorrow, perhaps, or regret, or maybe just the weariness of a father who must send his child into danger. "You do Asgard great honor today," Odin said quietly. "Greater than any battle you have won. It takes more courage to set aside your pride than to face any enemy in combat. When you return victorious, this deed will be remembered not as a humiliation, but as proof of your devotion to your people." Thor nodded, but said nothing. Words seemed inadequate to the moment. Instead, he simply embraced his father briefly, then turned and walked toward the courtyard where his goat-drawn chariot waited. The two goats, Tangrisnir and Tangjoster, looked up as Thor approached in his bridal finery, and if goats could look confused, these did. Thor climbed into the chariot with as much dignity as he could muster, which was complicated by the flowing dress. Loki leaped up beside him, managing to look graceful even in the unaccustomed clothing. "Take us to Jotunheim," Thor commanded, and his voice, despite coming from beneath a bridal veil, still carried the authority of a god. The goats leaned into their harness, and the chariot lurched forward. They crossed the courtyard, passed through the gates of Asgard, and began their journey across the Bifrost Bridge toward the realm of the giants. Behind them, every god and goddess of Asgard watched them go, and many offered silent prayers to whatever powers might listen that this desperate plan would succeed. The journey to Jotunheim was unlike any Thor had made before. Usually, when he traveled to the land of the giants, it was at the head of an army or in a fury of righteous anger, thunder rolling in his wake, lightning crackling around his chariot. Today, he traveled as a bride going to meet her groom, and the irony was almost physically painful. The goats pulled the chariot across the rainbow bridge, their hooves creating sparks of colored light with each step. Below them, the void between realms yawned dark and infinite. Thor gripped the rails of the chariot, his knuckles white beneath the sleeves of his dress. Beside him, Loki seemed perfectly at ease, even humming a wedding song under his breath until Thor's glare silenced him. As they descended from Bifrost and entered the borders of Jotunheim, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost formed on the chariot's rails. The air became thin and cold, burning in the lungs. The landscape transformed from the green fields of Midgard to the gray-white wasteland of the giants' realm. Mountains of ice rose in every direction, their peaks lost in clouds. The ground beneath the chariot's wheels was frozen solid, permafrost that had not thawed since the creation of the worlds. Despite himself, Thor was impressed by the violence of their passage. The goats, driven by his divine will, were not being gentle. The earth trembled beneath their hooves. Where the chariot's wheels touched the ground, ice melted and boiled away as steam. Mountains shook as they passed, sending avalanches cascading down into valleys below. If the giants had not known of their approach before, they certainly did now. Good, Thor thought grimly. Let them see that even dressed as a bride, he was not someone to be trifled with. They arrived at Thrym's palace as the sun, weak and distant in Jotunheim's sky, began to set. The giant king's hall was a massive structure built from ice and stone, its walls carved with scenes of ancient battles and old gods. Torches burned in sconces, their light reflecting off ice crystals to create a dazzling, cold display. As the chariot pulled into the courtyard, Thor could see that Thrym had spared no expense in preparing for his wedding. The courtyard had been cleared and decorated with what passed for festivity among frost giants. Great banners hung from the walls, woven from the hair of exotic beasts. The bones of enormous creatures had been arranged into archways and sculptures. Everything was crafted from ice, bone, and stone, beautiful in its terrible way, but utterly alien to the warm, living beauty of Asgard. Thrym himself emerged from the hall to greet his bride, and Thor got his first good look at the giant who had caused all this trouble. The king of the frost giants was even larger than Thor had imagined, perhaps 40 feet tall, with skin the color of deep ice and eyes like frozen lakes. He wore furs and armor made from the scales of creatures that should not exist, and on his head sat a crown of black ice. His face, when he smiled at the approaching chariot, showed genuine pleasure and anticipation. "Welcome," he boomed in a voice that made the ground vibrate. "Welcome, fair Freya, goddess of beauty, to what will now be your home. Welcome to Jotunheim, and welcome to your new life as queen of the frost giants." He approached the chariot and offered a hand the size of a shield to help Freya down. Thor took it, forcing himself not to crush the fingers in his grip, and stepped down with as much grace as he could manage. The dress complicated everything, but he managed not to trip. Up close, even through the veil, he could see the eagerness in Thrym's expression, the genuine belief that he had won some great prize. The giant king called out to his people, "Bring straw for the benches. Prepare the great hall. Tonight we feast to celebrate my marriage to the most beautiful goddess in all the 9 realms." His servants scurried to obey, moving with surprising speed for being so large. Thor and Loki, still in their disguises, were escorted into the great hall, a space so vast it could have held all of Asgard's greatest buildings, with room to spare. The ceiling was lost in shadows. Pillars of ice, each one carved into the shape of ancient giants, supported the roof. The walls were decorated with the preserved heads of creatures the giants had hunted and killed, their dead eyes reflecting the torchlight. Long tables had been set up, already groaning under the weight of food and drink. Whole oxen, roasted over fires that burned with blue flame. The fish the size of ships, caught in the frozen seas and prepared with herbs that grew only in eternal winter. Barrels of mead, each one large enough to drown a man. The feast was excessive, barbaric, and strangely impressive in its scale. Thrym led Thor to the place of honor at the high table, with Loki taking position slightly behind as a dutiful handmaiden should. The giant king sat beside his supposed bride, and gradually, the hall filled with giants. They came in all sizes and shapes, some blue as ice, others gray as stone, some bearing the marks of battles fought across millennia. They looked at Freya with a mixture of curiosity and something like pity. Even giants, it seemed, understood that this marriage was more capture than courtship. Thrym stood and raised a drinking horn the size of a barrel. "To my bride," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive hall. "To Freya, who has agreed to join her life to mine, to bring beauty to Jotunheim, and to forge a new alliance between giant and god. Let us feast in celebration of this union." The giants roared their approval and began to eat and drink with a legendary appetite of their kind. And this is where Thor's disguise encountered its first serious test. The problem was simple. Thor was hungry. He had been too anxious to eat breakfast in Asgard, and the journey to Jotunheim had been long. Now, confronted with tables full of food, his body demanded fuel. But a delicate goddess bride would not eat like Thor ate. A modest, feminine appetite would pick at food, take small bites, eat slowly and carefully. Thor tried. He truly tried to eat like he imagined Freya would. But within minutes, his natural instincts took over. He reached for an entire roasted ox, tore off a haunch, and began eating with the enthusiasm of someone who regularly burned thousands of calories battling giants and wrestling monsters. He devoured the ox with shocking speed, then moved on to an entire school of salmon, eating them one after another. When servants brought mead, he drank not in sips, but in great gulping draughts, emptying barrel after barrel. Across the table, Thrym watched this display with growing alarm. His bride had now consumed an entire ox, 8 large salmon, and was working on her 3rd barrel of mead. This was not the dainty, modest eating he had expected from a goddess of beauty. This was the eating of a warrior preparing for battle, or possibly of a starving bear. Thrym leaned toward Loki, who was eating with much more restraint. "Tell me," he said uncertainly, "does the goddess Freya always have such a hearty appetite? I have never seen anyone, god or giant, eat with such enthusiasm." Loki, his mind racing, barely missed a beat. "Oh, great king," he said in his assumed feminine voice, "you must understand. My lady Freya was so excited, so eager to meet you and become your bride, that she could not eat for 8 full days. She was consumed with anticipation, thinking only of this moment, this meeting, this union. Now that she is finally here with you, her relief and joy have restored her appetite all at once." Thrym's face cleared, and he beamed with pleasure. 8 days without eating, because of her eagerness to meet me? This is wonderful. This is more than I dared hope. What devotion! What dedication! The giant king's chest swelled with pride. The other giants at the table nodded and murmured approval. Such commitment from a bride was rare and praiseworthy. Thor, beneath his veil, allowed himself the tiniest smile of relief. Loki's quick thinking had saved them. He continued eating, though he tried to slow down slightly to avoid raising further suspicion. The feast continued, growing louder and more raucous, as the giants consumed truly staggering amounts of alcohol. They sang songs in their rumbling voices, songs of old battles and older grudges, songs of the days before the gods had risen to power. Some of the songs were about Thrym himself, celebrating his cunning in stealing Mjölnir and his success in claiming Freya as his prize. Thor listened to these songs with mounting fury, but he kept his hands still and his voice silent. The time for anger would come soon enough. As the evening progressed, Thrym grew more affectionate and more bold. He moved closer to his bride, his massive form dwarfing even Thor's considerable size. Finally, emboldened by mead and encouraged by his celebrating kin, the giant king decided it was time to claim a kiss from his bride. "I must see the face of my beautiful wife," Thrym declared, reaching for the veil. Surely, a husband has the right to kiss his bride on their wedding day. His massive hand grasped the edge of the veil, and he began to lift it. Thor, knowing he could not allow this without revealing his true identity, did the only thing he could think of. He raised his eyes to meet the giant's gaze and glared with all the fury and hatred he felt. Even through the thin fabric of the veil, the intensity of that glare was like looking into the heart of a storm. Thrym jerked backward as if burned, his hand releasing the veil. His face showed genuine shock and a touch of fear. "Great gods," he exclaimed, "why does my bride have such terrifying eyes? They burned like fire. They looked at me with such intensity, one thought I might be consumed." The other giants stirred uneasily. A bride should look upon her husband with affection, or at least acceptance, not with eyes that promised violence and death. Loki once again intervened, his voice soothing. "Oh, mighty Thrym, you misunderstand what you saw. My Lady Freya has not slept for 8 nights. So consumed was she with longing to see you, so eager to arrive at this day. Her eyes are red and burning from lack of sleep, from the passion of her anticipation. What you saw was not anger, but the fire of her desire to be with you at last. This explanation pleased Thrym even more than the last one. 8 nights without sleep, in addition to 8 days without eating? This goddess must be truly, deeply in love with him. He had worried that Freya might come to this marriage reluctantly, might need time to accept her new role. Instead, she seemed overwhelmed with passion for him. The giant king's chest swelled with pride and satisfaction. His fellow giants clapped him on the back, congratulating him on inspiring such devotion in his bride. Thor, meanwhile, kept his gaze lowered, not trusting himself to look at anyone without revealing the murderous rage building within him. Every moment of this charade felt like torture. The weight of the dress, the constriction of the veil, the obsequious words from Loki, the self-satisfied preening of Thrym, all of it fed the growing storm inside him. But he held himself still. He had come this far. The hammer must be close now. Thrym stood, raising his drinking horn again. The assembled giants fell silent, sensing that something important was about to happen. My friend, my people, the giant king declared, his voice solemn, now we have feasted well. We have celebrated the arrival of my bride. Now it is time to formalize this union, to speak the vows that will bind us together for all eternity. He gestured to one of his servants, an ancient giant who bore the marks of a priest or shaman. Bring forth the sacred hammer, Thrym commanded, so that my bride and I may be blessed in the name of Thor, goddess of vows and promises. Let Mjölnir sanctify this marriage. In the shadows at the back of the hall, several giants moved toward a storage area. Thor's heart began to pound so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. This was the moment. Everything depended on the next few minutes. The giants returned, struggling under the weight of what they carried. It took 4 of them, each enormous and powerful, to bear the burden between them. They carried it on a massive litter of iron and stone, and even from a distance, Thor could see the glow of divine power emanating from it. Mjölnir, his hammer, the weapon forged in the heart of a dying star, the instrument through which he channeled the very power of thunder itself. It looked exactly as he remembered, exactly as he had held it countless times before. The short handle wrapped in leather made from the hide of a cosmic beast. The massive head inscribed with runes of power. It was beautiful and terrible and perfect. The giants carried the hammer forward and, following Thrym's instructions, placed it carefully in the lap of the seated bride. The moment Mjölnir touched Thor's knees, even through the fabric of the dress, he felt the connection re-establish. The hammer recognized its true master. Power flowed into him like water finding its level, like lightning finding its path to ground. All the strength that had felt diminished without his weapon suddenly returned in full, magnified by his fury and his need. Thor's hands, which had been folded demurely in his lap, shot out and grasped the hammer's handle. The feeling of that familiar leather against his palms was like coming home after a long exile. His fingers wrapped around it, and he felt complete again. The god of thunder had been reunited with thunder itself. Thrym smiled benevolently, pleased with this part of the ceremony. The priest giant began to intone the words of the marriage blessing, calling upon Thor and the other gods to witness and sanctify this union. But he had spoken barely 3 words when Thor stood. The movement was sudden and violent. He rose to his full height, and as he did, his hand tightened on Mjölnir, and he raised it above his head. The other hand reached up and tore away the veil, the bridal cap, the carefully arranged disguise. The dress ripped as his muscles flexed, the delicate fabric never meant to contain such power. The bridegroom fell from his neck as the neckline tore. The keys at his waist clattered to the stone floor. What was revealed was not a blushing bride, but a god in full fury, his face red with rage, his eyes blazing with the promise of violence. Thor's roar shook the very foundations of the ice palace. The sound was not words, but pure rage given voice, and in it could be heard the rumble of thunder, the crash of waves, the grinding of tectonic plates. Before anyone could react, before the giants could even fully process what was happening, Thor's arm came down. Mjölnir struck Thrym in the center of his chest with a sound like a mountain splitting. The giant king, who had been smiling just seconds before, looked down in confusion at the hammer embedded in his ribs. He opened his mouth to speak, but blood came out instead of words. Thor twisted the hammer and pulled it free, and Thrym collapsed backward, dead before he hit the ground. The hall erupted into chaos. Giants leaped to their feet, reaching for weapons, shouting in alarm and rage. But they were drunk and unprepared, and Thor was a force of nature unleashed. He spun in a circle Mjölnir extended, and the hammer's path traced a ring of destruction. Giants who had been celebrating moments before found themselves flying backward, their bones shattered, their armor crumpled like parchment. Thor did not simply fight. He obliterated. Each swing of Mjölnir carried the weight of his humiliation, his rage at being forced into this disguise, his fury at having his weapon stolen. Giants fell like wheat before a scythe. Some tried to fight back, throwing spears the size of tree trunks, swinging weapons that could demolish castle walls. But without the element of surprise, without their king to organize them, and facing a Thor who fought with the accumulated anger of this entire terrible day, they had no chance. Loki, meanwhile, had transformed back into his usual form and was systematically dealing with any giant who tried to flee or call for reinforcements. The trickster god fought with daggers and magic, his style precise where Thor's was overwhelming. The feast hall became a slaughterhouse. The tables Thor had eaten from were smashed to splinters. The ice pillars cracked and shattered. The ceiling began to collapse as Thor's battle shook the entire structure. At one point, an ancient giantess, perhaps Thrym's mother or grandmother, approached Thor with her hands out, calling for mercy, asking for a wedding gift, as was traditional. Thor's response was to bring Mjölnir down on her head. There would be no mercy today. No survivors to tell tales of the giants who had dared to steal from the gods. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted perhaps 10 minutes. When it was over, when the last giant had fallen, Thor stood in the center of the ruined hall, breathing hard, covered in ichor and blood, still wearing the tattered remains of the bridal dress. Around him lay devastation, so complete that the hall would never be used again. Bodies of giants lay broken and still. The great ice pillars had fallen. The ceiling was open to the sky, through which snow was beginning to fall. Loki approached carefully, his daggers still in hand, his own clothes spattered with the evidence of battle. Thor looked at him, and for a moment neither spoke. Then Thor looked down at the remains of his disguise, at the torn dress and scattered jewelry, and despite everything, despite the violence and the anger, he began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, then grew into a full-throated laugh that rolled out across the ruins of Thrym's hall. Loki, after a moment's surprise, joined in. The two gods stood in the wreckage and laughed like madmen, releasing the tension of the day, the absurdity of what they had done, the relief of having succeeded. "Come," Thor said finally, his laughter subsiding. "Let us return to Asgard. I have my hammer. I have had my revenge. And I never, ever want to wear a dress again." They walked out of the ruined hall to where the goat-drawn chariot waited. The goats looked at Thor in his torn bridal gown, looked at the destruction visible through the hall's entrance. And if goats could shrug, these did. They had seen stranger things in their long service to the thunder god. The journey back to Asgard was faster than the journey out. Thor drove the goats hard, eager to be home, eager to remove the last traces of his disguise, eager to hold his hammer properly and feel like himself again. Behind them, Jotunheim lay quiet. Thrym's hall smoked and burned with cold fire. The giants who had witnessed the massacre were dead, and those who had not been present would find only ruins and corpses. The message was clear. Stealing from Thor, attempting to manipulate the gods, came with a price measured in destruction and death. As they crossed back over Bifrost, the rainbow bridge blazing beneath them, Thor could see all of Asgard laid out ahead. The golden halls gleamed in the light of the eternal sun. He could see the gods and goddesses gathered in the courtyard, waiting for their return. They had succeeded. Mjölnir was recovered. Asgard was safe. And Thor had paid a price in dignity that he would never, ever speak of again. The chariot pulled into the courtyard, and the assembled gods erupted in cheers. They surrounded Thor and Loki, congratulating them, asking for details, exclaiming over the recovered hammer. Thor climbed down from the chariot, still wearing the remains of the dress, and the first thing he did was strip off every last piece of it. The fabric tore easily under his hands, and he stood in the courtyard in his undergarments, not caring about propriety, just needing to be free of the disguise. Freya approached and, without a word, handed him his normal clothes, which he had brought in anticipation of this moment. Thor dressed quickly, then carefully hung Mjölnir at his belt where it belonged. The weight of it, the familiar presence, felt like a part of his soul returning. Odin approached, his single eye gleaming with pride and perhaps a touch of amusement. "Welcome home, son," the All-Father said. "You have done Asgard a great service today. Tell me, was the feast at least good?" Thor met his father's gaze, saw the slight smile lurking there, and felt his own lips twitch in response. "The food was acceptable," he said gravely, though the company left much to be desired. The courtyard erupted in laughter, and Thor allowed himself to smile. In the days that followed, life in Asgard returned to normal. Thor resumed his duties as protector of the realms, wielding Mjölnir in defense of gods and mortals alike. The giants, having lost their king and many of their strongest warriors, withdrew into Jotunheim and troubled Asgard no more for a long while. And of the day when Thor dressed as a bride, an unspoken agreement settled over Asgard. No one mentioned it directly. No one made jokes about it in Thor's presence. When the thunder god entered a room, conversation did not awkwardly cease. The gods showed him the respect his position demanded. But sometimes, when Thor walked by carrying his hammer, when the light caught Mjölnir just right and reminded everyone of that desperate plan, someone would catch someone else's eye. A slight smile would be shared, a knowing look exchanged. Because some stories, no matter how much everyone agrees not to tell them, are simply too good, too strange, too perfectly absurd to ever truly forget. Thor knew this. He saw the smiles, caught the glances. And while a part of him burned with the memory of that humiliation, another part, the part that had learned something about courage and sacrifice that day, understood. He had done what needed to be done. He had set aside his pride to save his people. And in the end, he had emerged victorious, had reclaimed his weapon, and had reminded the giants why they should fear the name of Thor. That was enough. That would always be enough. In the great hall that evening, as the gods gathered for their nightly feast, Loki stood and raised his cup. To Thor, he said, his voice carrying clearly, "To the bravest warrior in Asgard." The gods echoed the toast, and Thor, sitting in his place of honor with Mjölnir resting beside him, acknowledged it with a nod. He did not speak of what that bravery had cost him. He did not need to. They all knew. So what do you think of this incredible tale from Norse mythology? Can you imagine the mighty Thor dressed as a bride, suffering through a wedding feast, all to recover his stolen hammer? Would you have had the courage to set aside your pride like Thor did to save your home? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the strange and wonderful world of mythology, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We have so many more amazing stories to share with you, tales of gods and heroes, of trickery and triumph, of moments that shaped the very fabric of ancient belief. Hit that subscribe button now, because the next story we tell might be even more incredible than this one. Until next time, keep exploring the myths that remind us how complex, how human, and how entertaining the ancient gods truly were.